Chapter 5 is on the skeletal system. Our system includes about 206 bones. Believe it or not, some people have more, some have less. And this system also includes cartilage and ligaments and connective tissue, so it's not just bone. We're going to first look at the structure of our skeleton and then look at the functions. So our skeleton is divided into two skeletons, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Here in yellow and blue, you can see the axial skeleton, and it consists of the head, the neck, and the trunk. The appendicular skeleton consists of the arm and leg bones, as well as the girdles. So this here is the pelvic girdle, and this bone is called the coxa, or coxal bone, or hip bone, or pelvic bone. And up here we have the pectoral girdle, which includes the clavicle, which is your collarbone, and the scapula, which is your shoulder bone. The functions include support. We wouldn't be able to stand upright if we didn't have a spinal column with the vertebrae. Storage of minerals, in particular calcium and phosphorus. Inside the bones, we produce all of our blood cells. Our bones do provide quite a bit of protection. Our cranium protects our brain. Our vertebrae can protect our spinal cord. And our bones are responsible or necessary for movement. They attach to the muscles, and that provides for movement. So here's a bit more detail on the functions. Here are the minerals, calcium and phosphate. The bone stores these, so the bones are considered to be a reservoir for these minerals. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body, and 98% of that calcium is in the bones. We have calcium throughout the blood, and we have calcium that is required for correct muscle tissue function and correct nerve cell transmission. So calcium is essential for human life. In terms of protection, I'm sure you know what the ribs protect: the skull, the vertebrae, and then the pelvis cradles the digestive and reproductive organs, providing quite a bit of protection. Inside what is called spongy bone is red bone marrow. We have two types of bone, spongy bone and compact bone. Spongy bone contains bone marrow, red bone marrow when you're younger, throughout your spongy bone. And in this red bone marrow, we will produce red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. As we get older, some of this red bone marrow is converted to yellow bone marrow, which is essentially fat, because we do not need to make as many blood cells as when we are growing from a child to an adult. The skeletal system works with our muscles to allow movement because the bones act as levers. Which function is not associated with calcium? Blood cell production. Bones are classified by shape. We cover 4 shapes, but in A&P 168 there are actually 6 shapes, but we only talk about the flat, the long, the irregular, and the short. Flat bones, surprisingly our ribs are flat bones, but the bones of our cranium are flat. Long bones are longer than they are wide, and these bones of our hand and our fingers are also long bones because they are longer than they are wide. Short bones are kind of blocky, and look at those wrist bones called the carpals. Those are blocky, so those are short bones. And irregular bones include the vertebrae, the pelvis. We don't need to learn too many bone markings in this class. There are probably hundreds of bone markings. We will be learning some major bone markings, and a bone marking is this characteristic feature that relates to a function. There are elevations or projections where the tendons and ligaments attach. There are depressions and grooves and tunnels for blood vessel or nerve passage. So here are the 6 bone surface features or bone markings that we must learn. A meatus is a canal or passageway through the bone. When you put your finger into your ear, it is going through a meatus. A sinus is something many of you have trouble with. It is a chamber within a bone. These sinuses are filled with air and they lighten up the bones of our face, but they also are lined with mucous membrane. And when we have an allergy, too much mucus is produced and it blocks drainage from the sinus into our nasal cavity. When that mucus fills up the sinus, it compresses the air that's within there, and therefore we have the feeling of pressure in our forehead or our cheeks. That's where our major sinuses are. A foramen is a rounded passageway for blood. This says small, but we do have a very large foramen called the foramen magnum, and that is at the base of our skull where our spinal cord comes up into the brain. A fissure is a cleft or gap, and when we look into the eye socket, you will see fissures. A sulcus is a deep, narrow groove, and a fossa is a shallow depression. So you can see back here at the back of the eye, these fissures or cracks. It makes the eye susceptible to damage. There are quite a few bones that connect here in the back of the eye socket. And so it's pretty delicate structure back there. Here's a foramen. This is in the chin. You may remember that the chin is called the mental region. This is a mental foramen. And so the blood is coming up to the brain from inside the skull, and it has to get out here to supply the face. So these foramina are openings to allow the blood and the nerves to come out and supply the scalp and the face. What is a chamber within a bone called? That is a sinus. Here are some surface features we'll just look at quickly. You'll notice this rounded portion this is called the head. We have a head on our humerus as well as our femur. The humerus is the upper arm. There's no neck here. When we look at the femur, you're going to see a larger neck. But all of these depressions and projections all have names. So here's the femur. It also has a head, but it also has a neck. So let's go back. See how there's no neck on the humerus, but there is on the femur. This shaft of a long bone is called a diaphysis. A lot of different features on the pelvis. The pelvis is actually 3 bones fused together. The ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And this bone here that articulates or forms a joint between the 2 hip bones. This is the sacrum. And then down here is the tailbone, the coccyx. That's a remnant of our evolutionary tail. So here are some parts of a long bone that you do need to know. Epiphysis, epi is on top of, so the epiphysis is on the ends. So this epiphysis is closer to the trunk, so it's the proximal epiphysis. Down here is the distal epiphysis. The shaft is the diaphysis, This shaft is composed of compact bone surrounding a cavity called the medullary cavity. Now, in this cavity is yellow marrow, so there's no blood cells being produced in this part of the bone anymore. It would be in a child, but not in an adult. As an adult, the red bone marrow will be up here in the spongy bone, and you can see a difference structurally between that spongy bone and the compact bone. Compact bone is denser. At the end of the bone will be where the joint is. So this is the distal epiphysis of the femur. It's our upper thigh bone. So the knee would be right here. And at the end of the bone will be cartilage. On the bone is articular cartilage. And that articular cartilage allows a reduction in friction as that joint moves. That's the problem as we get old. We get osteoarthritis, and that breaks down the cartilage between the bones, and we end up with bone on bone, which can be quite painful. Here are two coverings of the bone. The outer covering is the periosteum, and you can see it's been peeled back a little bit here. And inside will be endosteum. Lining that medullary cavity is endosteum. Again, the ends of the bones are the epiphyses. The diaphysis is the shaft. Articular cartilage is at the end. That happens to be hyaline cartilage. If you cut through the bone, and you can see this cross section here, you can see all of this compact bone. Then there's the cavity, the medullary cavity, and right here where there's some spongy bone, right around that lining that cavity, is the endosteum. So the epiphysis, which is at the end of the bone, is spongy bone, and that looks radically different from the compact bone. You'll see what they call struts and plates called trabeculae, and it looks like a lattice work. It looks like bridges. It's really quite strong. I know the name is spongy, but it is not soft. Periosteum is the connective tissue covering around the bone that will isolate the bone from the surrounding tissues. And also the periosteum is quite important when the bone is growing and being repaired. That periosteum contains cells that will help the bone grow and repair. And there is a very extensive network of arteries and veins in the epiphysis and shaft. Our bone is very vascular, therefore it heals quite well. You can see a great blood supply here, going all the way up through here into the spongy bone here. Here the diaphysis is compact bone. The bone, we think of the bone mainly as calcium, but that's not true. A third of the bone is protein, and that protein is collagen. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. It's 1/3 the weight of the bone, and it's very strong and flexible. So it allows the bone to be resilient. And if the bone were just made of the calcium and phosphate, it would be much more brittle. We would break our bones more often. So when you combine the strong calcium phosphate with the more flexible collagen, our bones are really quite resistant to shattering. And here are some bones that have been soaked in vinegar, and vinegar will dissolve away the calcium. So it looks like the bone, but it's only the collagen remaining.